This is Modern Gaming Culture. This series will attempt to highlight the phenomenon of PC, console, and mobile gaming and bring to light all of its phenomenal aspects. Let's take a dive together into the world of modern gaming and take apart its structure. Now, here's your host, Rotimi Osagi. All right, this is Modern Gaming Culture. This is episode 6, Modern Gaming Culture. Last episode, I introduced it as a relaunch of Modern Gaming Culture. I talked about how the first episode I posted um, was an outtake I was doing as practice for the first episode I wanted to put up. And when I listened back to it, I liked it so much that I decided to make it the first episode. Right? There was a lot of stuff I did in that first episode where um, I wouldn't necessarily call them mainstays. Being very cryptic and kind of spooky. I feel like I was being in the first episode, so I apologize for a little of that stuff. Um, you know, um, Especially with a show, when that's gonna get very heavy, right? I don't want to scare people away with things that may not you know be very attractive, especially for a show of this kind, right? Especially a show of this scale too, right? I talked about how in the first episode, about how there was essentially like a censorship wave in the mid 2010s, right, where a lot of these big tech platforms took down a lot of content, right? Shortly after YouTube, was bought by Google, right? And um, these guys conducted a lot of censorship, right? And particularly the field of internet radio was hit huge because that time, right, you could go onto YouTube, right, and people were posting, right, internet radio show style content that was getting hundreds of thousands of views, right, in a few hours, right, and these people had hundreds of thousands of subscribers, and they were attracting a large audience, right, and they were bringing together this audience, right, of people who were hungry for new internet radio shows, right, and that censorship wave scared off a lot of that audience, right, and it also split that audience apart as well, right. These people who were kind of looking forward to this, accessibility of new internet radio, right, especially a lot of these people, younger people, right, people who are like 15, 16 years old, right, growing out of radio, right. Maybe you guys are going on road trips, or you have to drive a long way to go to school or something like that, and you're just turning on the radio, falling in love with all of these internet radio hosts, I mean these radio hosts rather, right, and really enjoying that medium, right, and having it um, transfer onto the internet, right? And really, getting excited for that profession's, work, right? A lot of it just being completely erased because a lot of these people who got censored, right, didn't, back up their work maybe on a website or on another video hosting platform, right? And so not only that, not really spreading out your reach as well, right? Um, by promoting your work on other platforms, right? Um, so that your audience can rebuild, right? When you move your content, right? Since it's not being hosted on YouTube anymore, right? And so having these people get spread out, right? Um, into internet ghettos essentially, right, was a huge hit on internet radio as a whole, right? Um, what it did, though, right, to continue on that, is that it opened a lot of opportunities for people who may be a little more opportunistic journalists, right? And not necessarily people who are really trying to reach people, right? People who just have accessibility to, things like, travel, right? And also just, favors, political favors, particularly, wanting to enter, the arena of, internet publishing as a profession, right? um, Taken a lot of attention away from the field of internet radio, right? Especially when there's still people who didn't really get taken down, right, by this internet censorship, you know, doing very powerful work, right, bringing together a lot of very powerful audiences, right, and basically being silenced, right, by the chorus of this sort of opportunistic journalism that sort of rose up um, in the ashes of this censorship wave, right? Um, you know, it was hard to get internet radio, right? Because, when it comes to a political campaign, right? Or a political, or a political um, term, right? A political stint. Um, it's very much its legacy is very important when it comes to incidences, right, during these stints, right. And so uh with this rise of internet radio, right, addressing it, right, and not promising um to address it, right, um in terms of a dispute, right, um can really do damage to your career politically, right? And so, in almost like a technological fascism, right? The powers that be really left that to the tech giants to deal with, right? And so a lot of these people whose careers were launching or really reaching their peak, right? People like Joe Biden, right? Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, right? Um, were pretty much saved by the bell, right? And were not their political legacies were not stained by this uprising, right? Really what it was, honestly. So, you know, I talk about how that is something that is going to be a mainstay topic, right? On the show, right? Um, because with the little coverage it got and the little bureaucratic political effect, influence that it really had, right? Because another thing we're going to talk about is political different types of political influence, right? And so another thing I want to kind of address right before I continue is also that I've been trying to keep a very steady temperance, right, in terms of delivery, because a lot of this material can get very heavy, and so I don't want to kind of lose my cool, right, and sort of steer things away, um, because you know, but also, right, I was talking about in the last episode about how I want to be more spontaneous, right? Understanding kind of um, where government culture is at, right? Understanding, these people, I talk about how people want to reach, right? These people don't necessarily need somebody who is going to, lean into them, right? For not being perfect enough or something like that, right? So, uh, but at the same time, um, I also want to, uh, meet people where they're at, right? And I understand that a lot of material that people consume may seem a lot more challenging, right? And so, to kind of counteract that sort of sentiment, right? I think I'm gonna want to move to a more challenging, temperance, right? So that it doesn't throw you off, right? I know this is a very you know hard hitting material, right? And I want it to be, right? And so, interest of what's known as the zeitgeist, right? It's not really an English term for it. Zeitgeist is a German term, I believe. Um, you know, I'm going to try to, cater to that audience as well, right? Because, it has to do with this topic as well, because a lot of that audience, were people who were consuming internet radio, in the mid 2010s, right? And may have, again, right, cornered themselves into this, internet ghetto, right? And want, a place to really reunite in terms of internet radio, right? And I consider myself a pioneer of, a new era of internet radio almost, right? And so, obviously I don't expect, right? Obviously I want to have a large audience, right? I want to reach a large audience, right? With this, right? I've talked about how I'm not unfamiliar with internet publishing, right? These are things I really have to qualify because, um, as much as I understand my material is going to be very hard hitting and very important, right? I also understand, a lot of political biases that people can have, right? People that, may look a certain way or sound a certain way, right? Not sort of, delivering the message that they would normally expect, right? From that type of character, right? Um, I also understand I have to qualify these things, right? Um, and so, yeah, I understand that, you know, um, uh, I want to reach a larger audience, right? And I want my material to be hard hitting, right? But I also understand that I'm trying to reach people with very heavy material that's going to, help them improve, right? Especially when it comes to the realm of gaming culture, or modern gaming culture, as I call it, right? Um, and are going to be inspired, right, to want to pursue uh, internet radio, right, and may want to sort of elaborate on a lot of the material that I present here, right, or maybe it can fill some holes in material that they want to present, right, and then they can, produce a show themselves, right, with a lot of more holes filled in, so that it's more palatable, right, and they can have a lot more continuity, right, and confidence in themselves that they can do it as well, right. I think I've talked about it. I don't know if it was an outtake or not. I don't remember, but talked about the Dunning Kruger effect and its psychological bias, right, where people with a lot less knowledge, right, may have much higher confidence, right, than people who have a lot more knowledge, right, expressing a lot less confidence, right. A show like this is monumental in its scope and scale, right. What I'm really attempting to do here, right? And so, you may feel daunted, right? Especially with what I've referred to as the zeitgeist, right? Or it's referred to as the zeitgeist, right? Which is like, it's a German term which means basically the spirit of the times, right? The word zeit means uh, time, right? And then geist means spirit, right? You know, with really the zeitgeist, right? Um, you know, a show like this is really very monumental in its scope and scale, especially what I'm attempting to do, right? And so um, it's something where especially in the earlier episodes, right? If I don't really come on and I'm not just pretty much swinging the hammer like I'm kind of doing right now, right? People will not really understand, right? What I'm really trying to do, despite the material being so valuable, in my opinion, right? And so, I think I'm just gonna have to, in the interest, right, of really, especially with how I'm gonna also try to, format this, right, where I'm not necessarily gonna come on here and be like a TV show, right? Where, the show may be like 21 minutes, right? But, there's 9 minutes of, advertisement. So it fits into a 30-minute, window, right? A lot of people who were doing internet radio, right, were doing the office shows, and some people are still doing it on radio shows, internet radio stations, right? And they have time slots and station breaks and stuff like that, right? And then, like I was saying, like the people who were coming from, traditional radio to internet radio, right? Um, Me personally, right? That transition was it was very smooth, right? Because, I never really liked commercial breaks, right? I never really enjoyed, someone being cut off, right? Especially when they're really getting to a good point, right? And so when I was, moving on to the internet, right, to really consume that type of material, um, it was very smooth for me because I didn't really miss the commercials, right? The commercials were never filled in for me, it was almost like a suspense of disbelief, right? And so, uh, you know, especially considering how this is going to be a lot more of a freestyle format, right? It's going to take a myriad of forms, right? Like episodes two through four, right? It was one sitting I did those episodes, right? I felt really prepared to present that material, so I decided, to just do all three of those episodes at once, right? And so, this is something that was very common, and people still do this today, right? Still, people still, will, produce, right, and then do post production, right, and post like three shows at a time, right? And so it's not something that's uncommon, right? With just the realm of internet publishing, right? It's just that with particularly internet radio, well, which is really taking the forms, these days, basically, mainstream media, sort of like soapbox, the mainstream media like soapbox, right, hour, right, um, or something like that, right, uh, or you know, flavor of the month, kind of like these like sort of lifestyle type of shows, right? Um, so you won't really get a large variety, right? And so I understand, basically having a lot of shoes to fill, right? Um, but again, right? As much as I've been talking about, um, as much as I've been talking about, sort of, internet radio, it's also just qualifying a lot of stuff as well, right? Talk about how I've prepared a lot, for the show, right? Um, and I'm also not just fighting an uphill battle, right? Especially considering with how internet radio has been going, right? They've been trying to take away that sort of resistance, right? That can really occur when you're trying to do something new, right? When you're trying to do something brand new, right? And basically taking away the people who are just aspiring internet radio show hosts, right? By basically, forcing them to really have a very curated, tempered, right, precise message, right? Or else they can't even, have their work hosted, right, or even monetized in some cases, right? And then basically what they've been doing, you know, is taking these, talking heads, right, from politics, right, and giving them shows, right? People like Donald Lemon, Michelle Obama, right? And so, you know, again, scares away a lot of people who would have been, very powerful, right? And again, it goes back to the zeitgeist, right? Like, especially when you're seeing, you're just like, okay, you know, okay, who's coming on and doing the internet publishing, right? and all you're seeing is, all these people from television or from politics, you're gonna be like, okay, well, damn, right? Not knowing, right, which we'll get into, right? This is something I was really practicing for when I wanted to even do this episode. I was really trying to get into this discussion about, the type of people that are really in gaming culture, right? I've kind of hinted at this, right? You know, about things, people don't really know what's out there, right? Um, but again, right? Um, when you have such a tight grip on the balls, the metaphorical balls of people, right? Um, it seems right a lot less, a lot less of a challenge and more of a hurdle, right? And so I think one thing I want to really do for this episode, really get into the stratas of people who are really in gaming culture, right? I think I just want to hint at it though, and maybe will intersperse it right with the next few episodes. But people in gaming culture, right, have really, especially these days, right, have really developed skill sets that have never really existed in the in the concentration, right, and the effect, right, in human history, right? Um, where normally if you would have this type of strength, right, concentrated, right, it would be, something that required a lot of sacrifice, a lot of humiliation, a lot of ridicule going through, right, a lot of hardships, right, very palatable, right? Um, Whereas now with this melting pot culture in the West, right, you have this similar concentration of power that would require a very palatable sacrifice, willpower, humiliation, ridicule, etc. Except it's a very unpalatable, you know, of those vectors, right? And interspersed with a lot of different cultures, a lot of different economic, financial brackets, social brackets, right? So it is such a really unique time that we're living in, right? Um, and so it's gonna be something I want to get into in the next few episodes, right? But I think I want to really just reel things in a little bit for this episode and sort of get things back on track, particularly with how this show is going to really be delivered. Right? The main thing I really want to talk about, right, is about um, the spontaneity and the challenges that we really face in gaming culture these days, right? I have a very I have a very good vantage point on discussing this because you know um, I don't know if I've talked about this yet, but my older brother, right, is a distributor, right? He does distribution for hobby shops, right? Particularly a lot of these, hobby shops that are doing, these, um, these like tabletop games, right? And so um, the business in which he works out of, right? Um, you know, is an organization, right? Of these types of people, right, who really come together, right, and have concentrated their talents, right, towards the uplift of gaming culture, right. Um, you know, we reach a very large, you know, um, demographic, right, and so um, you know we have a lot of things that we really have to deal with, particularly, right, that affect the direction of our business, right. Obviously it's not our business, right, but we're so we're so built into it, right, that we're almost like a cog in the machine that can't really be removed, right. um, and so you know um, when we're really making a lot of strides, right? We have a lot of, you know, things in the aftermath to really deal with, right? We have a lot of tracking, right? Taking stock, inventory, right? Contemplating, right? Putting pieces together, right? Etc. Right? Um, and so, you know, when we think things are certainly, steering towards a certain direction, right? We receive, right, something that may, you know, really spark a lot of curiosity in us, right? That may, steer things to a direction that, was more suited, right? And so, in the interest of that, I really want to prepare the audience, which I'm going to be reaching through this, operation, right? Um, for that, so that I don't come on, right, and I'm just spooking people. Game culture is is a very different environment than the political arena, financial arena, the economic arena, etc. Right, and so you know people it's almost because things seem so like similar, right? Especially with a lot of these people who really champion, gaming culture, right? Um, they think that things are kind of same everywhere, right? In terms of what needs to really be done there, etc. Right? And so a thing I'm gonna really have to prepare people for is the fact that when you come onto the show, right, you're gonna be getting you're gonna almost be getting like a eyes in the sky um look, right, at gaming culture, right? Especially considering a lot of things we have in the pipeline as well, right? And so I just really need to prepare people for that so that I don't have a lot of things to really fill in, right? Especially when I'm starting to reach a large audience and I'm really trying to concentrate them somewhere, right? So that I can meet people there, right? And so I don't have to just come on here and have to address a lot of stuff, right? So uh, you know, uh, yeah, it's going to be very spontaneous, right? And it's going to turn into a more noteworthy show, right? Where you don't really have to, wash things in right? In order to really get the big picture, right? Doesn't necessarily mean you should just take things out of context, right? You should definitely, compare and contrast, right? But at the same time, right? This is not going to be like the Joe Rogan Experience, right? Or Tucker Carlson tonight. I don't even know what the show's called. Um, so just to be prepared for that, right? So I'm just gonna leave it there. This episode, for the former part of this episode, um, and to conclude, you know, uh, that is a very, the way I've really been, trying to really kind of slow things down like I'm doing right now, right? To, you know, um, meet people where they're at, right? It's definitely important, right? And especially if I'm going to be presenting certain type of material, probably going to have to be that very, steady figure, right? But I also realized that these shows that have really taken the internet by storm, right? Are especially because they have things like again, right, contracts, right, timestamps, right, a lot of bureaucratic um, you know hurdle hoops they have to jump through, right? um, they have the agency, right, in spite of not really being equipped to really equip, right, um, to carry that sort of temperance, right, that I kind of have through this episode, right? Um, which does definitely impart a lot more of a attentive, spirit in people, right? Um, but you know, um, understanding, right? Getting people up to speed with gaming culture, right? I definitely am gonna have to reel that in a little more, even though I definitely know that people will respond to that type of energy a lot better. Um, I just understand that, answering the arena of public radio, right, of internet radio, you know, um, in times like this, you can't really, you know, just for the sake of posterity, really put on a mask. So I'm gonna try to, take a mask off a little more, right, and you know, compete, you know. So I'll leave it there for this episode. So thank you. This has been Modern Gamer Culture, and I'll see you.